Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and welcome to today's question and answer hour, where I will attempt to answer questions about the videos released this past week about ADHD in general, or more broadly about mental health. As usual, the comments I'm making are intended for informational purposes and not as specific recommendations for what you should be taking or not. But I do welcome all questions, philosophical, medical, direct medication questions, whatever's going on. Um, so I will review the two videos quickly and then jump into the Q&A part. So the two videos, one was a sound re-editing of the Alzheimer medications, and the second one was a new, maybe rambling and less ADHD related or tied in explicitly about intentions. So with the with the Alzheimer medications, there have been sort of at least two big waves of medications. We've had medications FDA approved for treating Alzheimer's for more than 20 years. The first medications were acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. So those prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine. And research still supports that some of the cells that take the very large hit early on in the progression of Alzheimer's or clinical Alzheimer's are acetylcholine neurons. So this was an attempt to preserve functioning of what was left. It doesn't save, doesn't bring any cells back to life, probably doesn't extend the life of those that are being damaged by unclear processes. The acetylcholinesterase excuse me, inhibitors, though, have lots of gastrointestinal side effects, were intolerable for lots of people. And that led to memantine, which is a glutamate NMDA blocker, being employed and FDA approved for Alzheimer's. Again, both of these seem to be helpful with decreasing the rate of deterioration in memory and other functions, but don't seem to address the underlying processes. And then in the last few years, we've had some antibody or immune system monoclonal antibody-based treatments. Lecanemab is the one I think that's still on the US market, which are specifically targeting amyloid plaque. And a hallmark of Alzheimer's dementia is cellular debris accumulating in a specific neurochemical kind called beta amyloid plaque that accumulates outside of nerve cells and tau fibrillary tangles inside of nerve cells. These are closely correlated with progression of the condition and are often used diagnostically, but there is growing debate as to whether deterioration or formation of amyloid plaque is actually the primary driving force of Alzheimer's, or whether it's just a sign of some other process that's causing damage. So these approaches very clearly do reduce the amyloid plaque burden in the brain, but they do overall slow again the progression. But it's not completely clear whether they're changing the course of the disease or condition. And again, the evidence is overwhelming that Alzheimer's is probably a process that's starting 30, 40 years before clinical signs are showing up. So that's one video. The second video was on intention. And even though we spend our lives creating little narrative scenarios in our head about why we're doing things, why other people are doing things to us, with us, for us, it's hard and tricky to judge other people's or other animals' intentions. Part of that's because it is an internal process. We can look at behavior, we can see whether behavior aligns with intentions. Part of it is because even the person doing the acting, their intentions may be partly clear to themselves, but part of them, because of Freud got at least one thing right, that there is an unconscious mind, and it is having pervasive influence on how we make decisions. And then a third factor of partial inaccessibility is a large proportion of our actions are As Kahneman, the Nobel-winning economist, says, system one, they are automatic, they are quick, they are not allowing time for reflection. So if you haven't had time to reflect, then it's even harder to know what your intention was when you act so quickly that you're acting without thinking. So that's what I'll say for now about intention, unless there's questions coming up. And I do see there's some questions already on screen. So, hi, Max. Max says fatigue seems to be a common symptom in every psychiatric condition. You think patients and doctors should be more aware and concerned with persistent and/or recurring phases of fatigue? I'd say it's certainly prominent in many. So it's prominent in depression. It can be an aspect of ADHD. I would argue, almost by definition, it's absent in mania. Um, I'm not thinking of a strong connection with OCD. And with schizophrenia, we have a range of what are called secondary symptoms. So the first symptoms are the florid psychosis, delusions, disruption of reality testing. But in schizophrenia, probably causing at least as much disability are um, anhedonia, lack of pleasure, lack of social communication, sort of flattening of affect. And I'm not sure whether I would say fatigue or whether it's lower motivation to act. So fatigue would be feeling more tired, even if you're not doing anything. I mean, you could be fatigued from having exerted yourself either mentally or physically, but also a aura of tiredness without having done much. Um, so, should patients and doctors be more aware of and concerned with persistent and or recurring phases of fatigue? My answer there is if it's causing problems or leading disrupted function, then you're probably talking about it already with your doctor. If fatigue develops gradually, so for perhaps with chronic fatigue syndrome, which we have different names for now, I mean, as a fatigue that comes on gradually, that might it be harder to detect since your baseline is slowly shifting and you might have trouble recalling what you used to be able to be capable of. Yes. Um, and this is oversimplifying. I mean, to the extent that there's some correlation between fatigue and brain fog, there does seem to be a brain inflammatory component there. Um, the medications that seem most helpful with fatigue seem to be several stimulants and others that are used for treating ADHD. But whether that's just helping arousal in general or getting at the cause of fatigue, so it's probably symptomatic rather than helping the underlying mechanisms of what's causing the fatigue. So maybe until we have a more precise way of assessing it and treating it, maybe our level of discussion about fatigue is maybe good enough as where it is right now. So Hamed asks, how reliable is a neuropsychiatric assessment in regards to diagnosis of inattentive ADHD? So I'll answer that more broadly, and I'll sort of echo what Russell Barkley, who is a psychologist himself, one of the most prominent ADHD researchers, writers, speakers, and he's designed his own neuropsychiatric rating scales. So one, purportedly neuropsychiatric testing is giving us an objective measure of someone's capabilities or functions. Um, So there's a number of standardized tests which are supposed to be administered in a standardized way, and they give a standardized number which tells us if you're outside the boundaries for those and can measure things like working memory and response inhibition and a host of other executive functions. So to begin with, even though the instructions are to administer these in the same way, I've been subjected to some of these tests, and many administrators vary their protocol and even how they're interpreting answers based on some of their own biases or assumptions rather than strictly how they should be administered. Um, More pervasively, when I worked in San Francisco for 30 years, there were a handful of neuropsychologists who, again, did supposedly standardized testing and absolutely, and who didn't believe that ADHD existed or was a condition. So it didn't matter how robust someone's ADHD conditions were. It didn't matter how devoid of any other comorbid condition they were. Anyone referred to them got an answer of, no, this isn't ADHD. This is probably something else. On the other hand, there were a handful of neuropsychologists in the other direction who saw ADHD in everything. So, not that this is completely useless and unreliable. So, the biggest use, or the most, not the biggest, the most helpful use of neuropsychological testing is when you have precise questions: is this A or B? Or is this inattentive ADHD? Or is this ongoing low grade depression, or anxiety? There may be some useful findings which strongly push an interpretation one direction or another, but neuropsychiatric assessment, I mean, backing up, many boards, I think the law school boards, a few others used to require, some of them may still, neuropsychiatric testing, and yet every professional organization, from the pediatricians to the psychiatrists to the ADHD specialists, say that the gold standard evaluation for someone with ADHD is a clinical interview with someone familiar with the condition. So, again, not that there are maybe a few cases where neuropsych testing may add something or uncover something that wasn't suspected before, but a thorough clinical evaluation is very likely to turn up all those possibilities. So I'd say, unless you have money to spend on a test, because often insurance doesn't cover this, and they're usually several hundred to a few $1,000s these days. Again, a thorough clinical evaluation is probably going to give you as much information as you're going to get from these tests, except again in some rare situations. So I probably beat that one to death. That would be my take, and I think other people who have seriously studied the questions take on it. I'm not. So Max is asking, how do I feel about the term expert? It seems a bit overused and aggrandizing most of the time, and yet seems appropriate for some people. Um, I'd agree with both aspects of it. Some people are clearly using it for self-aggrandizement, or that they're basking in reflected glory if they talk about consulting the experts or being in agreement with the experts. It's a term I resisted for a long time. I mean, whether being the person that Andrew Huberman asked to talk about ADHD elevates me to the level of expert, or whether having put out a few hundred videos on ADHD and other mental health related topics. So yes, so one is it's an imprecise term. So it's both imprecise, one, subjective, two, um, three, often self-referential. But is it useful for differentiating people we should be listening to versus people we shouldn't? I mean, I would sort of use it in that sense that by definition, anyone who's worth listening to is an expert, at least on a narrow range or subset of that topic. I'd say the other confusing thing about it is that the range of expertise gets blurred. I mean, often In this day and age, we attack people, I mean, particularly politicians attack Olympic athletes for speaking about anything politically, or movie stars. I mean, particularly they do it when they disagree with the views. Um, but their own attacking or commenting about Olympic activities or movie filming or a rock star or music activities is considered perfectly okay. So that's sort of stay in your own lane if you're in my lane, but I can go in anyone else's lane. Um, but again, the topic of how narrow someone's expertise is, I mean, are they an expert on neuropsychological testing for ADHD? Are they an expert on more broadly ADHD in general? Are they an expert on mental health, whatever that would mean? Um, so the scope of expertise, even if you are an expert, probably should be considered when listening to someone's advice. So a follow-up question is, what medication is recommended for impulsivity, fidgeting, anxiety, and task initiation? So the stimulants, which are conventional by the experts, who I would disagree with on this one, consider amphetamine and methylphenidate are two first choice stimulants for ADHD, and there's good data that they do help if you're in the correct dosage range. So too little doesn't do much, and too much can push people the other way. But they measurably in studies can help with impulsivity. They measurably can help with fidgeting. Um, they measurably can help with task initiation. They're less good at deciding which tasks to initiate. And to the extent they help with anxiety, it's anxiety that's secondary to ADHD. And I have videos on anxiety and ADHD overlap. The commonest side effects of too much stimulant, even in someone with ADHD, is to cause over-arousal, over-agitation, which has a high degree of overlap and is part of anxiety. But again, stimulants can decrease anxiety. In terms of sort of separate from an ADHD construct, there is some evidence for valproate, which is Depakote, which is an approved drug for bipolar disorder, that may help with certain aspects of impulsivity or particularly emotional volatility. Um, so Animals Lamina. Animals Lamina asks, I'm curious about ADHD interacting with women differently throughout the cycle. I'm presuming menstrual cycle, could be life cycle. So it's a topic that has widely been neglected, largely because the preponderance in early studies of ADHD in childhood seeming to show that twice as many boys as girls have it, and then not even being aware of ADHD into adulthood. So most of these people were um, prepubertal who were being studied who were girls. So it's only in the last 2 decades we're studying adults much more and we're studying women much more, and it's still widely understudied. So certainly, absolutely anecdotally, there are many women with ADHD whose experience different severity of symptoms across their menstrual cycle in a reproducible fashion. Estrogen, and maybe more so than progesterone, but estrogen very clearly has receptors in the brain, affects a wide range of neural circuitry. There's clearly, and I have a video on menopause, some evidence that ADHD symptoms can be replicated in the menopause and perimenopausal time for women who never had anything looking like ADHD. So it's conceivable that drops in estrogen or lower estrogen levels may be associated with worsening of ADHD symptoms. But there's not a lot of rigorous studies so far. I mean, part of it is these are challenging studies to do because you need to study, you need to make sure that you know what part of the cycle these women are at. You need to be testing multiple time points. comparing them to yourselves, and or what's your comparison group you're looking at. Um, and that's the separate or interacting question: are the ADHD medications likely to act differently at different times of a woman's cycle? And I would say conceptually, to me, that certainly makes sense or is possible. Again, because there are estrogen receptors in the brain, it is affecting how neurotransmitters work. There's a side thought I was going to make, but I've just lost that train of thought. Yeah, so it's a good question. Oh, no, no, the other interesting thing is PMS itself. So what we know is that there does not seem to be a difference between hormonal cycle fluctuations in terms of progesterone levels, estrogen levels, in terms of peaks, in terms of how quickly they're declining or growing. There's no difference among women who are having significant PMS symptoms and women who are not having PMS symptoms. So rather than just looking at hormonal levels themselves, there's probably something to do with hormonal receptors and either their numbers or how functional they are or not. So I hope that's a useful start. And again, I do have a video on menopause. So I'm just saying I have symptoms like asking repeated questions or making repeated comments or talking before I think. What do you think this is leaning towards? So asking the same question over again and or repeating comments suggests that your working memory isn't accurately or short-term memory isn't keeping track of what you've done or said. So certainly ADHD is a possibility there, a highly likely possibility, but certainly states of anxiety. So one is that it brings up the interaction between multiple different executive functions. And so, for example, we know if you're not in training, if you're not paying attention well, you're not going to encode the information well, and that won't be there for retrieval. So the fact that you don't remember sort of asking something, or that could be a memory problem itself, it could be an attentional process itself, it could be an anxiety problem that's leading to disruptions of attention when you're supposed to be storing data. It could be depression leading to lack of attention or intention when you're asking questions. And talking before you think would be usually interpreted more as a sign of impulsivity. I had someone commented on one of my videos there that they felt that they are purely inattentive ADHD, but they do lots of blurting out and interrupting others. And they felt that they're only doing that because they didn't know the right times or not paying attention to when they should be talking. But by definition, impulsivity is an impulsive action. It's acting without thinking of the consequences. So even if it interacts with inattention, there's certainly inattentive people who aren't blurting things out. So that taking the motor action, the movement, the acting in a way moves it from inattentive realm to an impulsive realm. So what else might lead to talking before you think? Again, I'm not. This doesn't sound likely from what you've already said, but there's certainly narcissistic personality types who don't really care what other people have to say, or don't really care or actually actively don't want to hear what other people have to say. So they may be more prone to just saying what's ever at the top of their mind without thinking too deeply about it, or wondering whether it's appropriate, or whether they're cutting people off. So yes, all of our current diagnoses and the DSM is undergoing revision, or maybe radically. our current system is based on symptoms and collections of symptoms, and it's been relatively easy, although it takes a lot of work and thinking to come up with scales and validated ways to score different people's symptoms. But symptom checklists are only ever a starting point. So again, it depends a lot on the context in which those symptoms are occurring, what prompts them, what makes them more likely, what makes them less likely. They only happen at certain times of day. Do they only happen in certain situations? Are they affected by different medications, substances, sleep, other factors? And what's their time course over the years or months? Is it something that was there since childhood? Is it only there since puberty? Is it something that shows up episodically? Is it there every day in life, even if severity is fluctuating? So again, symptoms are a great place to start, and that's the sort of the foundation of our current diagnostic mental health system, but it's only one part of how we make any diagnoses. So I'm certainly welcoming more questions. I will say a little bit more about the intention talk, and part of it was triggered by sort of a strange confluence of two different news articles that popped up right at the December, January last few months about animals using tools. So one example was a cow named Veronica with a K. One of my daughters is named Veronica. She's not a cow. So Veronica has lived for years on an Austrian farm, and she was researched by research. Her behavior was researched by two ethologists, animal behavior specialists at the University of Vienna, and they observed on multiple occasions Veronica using sticks and a sort of a small push broom to scratch or itch herself in areas that she couldn't reach with her tongue or tail or hooves. And not only did she use this object, but with the brush, she used the bristly end for more hardier parts of her hide, and she used the smooth handle end on more delicate parts of her skin, which to them clearly demonstrated intentionality, that she's thinking about this object, she's using it in a way that meets some need for her, and and using it differently in different situations. So she's not just blindly picking up the stick and moving it around. The second example was a in British, yeah, British Columbia, a First Nation tribe had put out crab pots, I think was for an invasive green crabs that were raiding their fisheries. So these were traps in right offshore in the ocean. A buoy's marking a rope tethered to the trap, but the trap, even at low tide, was below water. And they found that several of the traps had been broken into and the bait stolen by some animal, and they didn't know what was going on. And a team from State University of New York, um, I'm not sure what they were doing up in British Columbia, but were investigating and put out a video camera and observed, which recorded a wolf swimming out to the buoy, biting the buoy in her teeth, swimming back to shore, and then methodically biting on the rope and pulling the whole trap into the shore, and then opening the trap and extracting and eating the bait. And most or many animal behaviorists also figured that this is an example of intentional tool use, that she's using an object to she's manipulating an external object in her environment in a way to obtain a specific goal or reach a specific goal. And whether this counts as modification or manipulation. So when Veronica uses the broom handle in two different ways, she's using it and employing it differentially to show that she knows what she's doing. I would argue that using a rope and the buoy for purposes somewhat differently than they were initially intended is sort of the showing the same amount of intentionality. The interesting thing is that there's a quote from one of the researchers who said, well, the fact that she couldn't even see the baited trap during this whole process of swimming out to the buoy, so the water's ocean water churning up. It's not clear where she can see to the bottom. Um, Shows some intentionality and that she planned out this chain of events. And my thought was that was so human centric viewing of the situation. And later he does acknowledge that she could probably smell the food the whole time, but for humans, we can see it, then it makes it a simpler problem to retrieve this object. I would argue that this wolf was seeing with her nose where the food was all the time. Again, I don't think that detracts from she clearly took a sequence of events, a complex sequence of events to get at her goal. So to me, it meets dual use, but it brought to my mind how when we're trying to sort out what's going on in the mind of another, particularly one as different as a different species, it's easy to start making assumptions as to what they might be thinking or doing that aren't right. And I think with humans, we also frequently misjudge, misassess what someone else's intentions are, and we are more likely to do so the more different the other person is, whether it's a different culture, different age, a different gender, um, different political or religious or cultural background. Okay, so and so KG Dag host also has a question about AI. So I also many cognitive researchers claim adamantly that AI is not intentional and is not making thinking, but I would our assumption that other people are thinking is often based on what's going on our own head, and how we learn language is not that differently than how AI is being taught to learn language. And yes, there's clear-cut examples that show that it's not comprehending. I mean, it's interesting when I use a spell checker, an AI-based spell checker, it does a great job of fixing lots of typos and where I'm missing, I use the wrong tense, or I had a plural where it should be a singular verb, or vice versa. But then maybe I'm using somewhat uncommon verbal constructions, but there's other cases where let's say something about individuals who are doing X, Y, or Z, and it will want to put in an apostrophe there, which is completely inappropriate. And its inappropriateness of its suggestion shows that it really didn't understand the sentence in any human way of understanding the sentence. Anyway, so so KG is mentioning that they've been talking to AI and working with it, and it's helped their ADHD lately. And I see AI as a tremendously powerful tool that can be both really helpful, and I'd also say it has the potential for undermining people's executive functions. My kids are talking about they're just finished college. At winter break, when we were all together, they were talking about a friend who has significant ADHD and how she was sort of contracting out her planning, scheduling, sorting things out, how to prioritize to AI. And they were lamenting that these were important skills, that they were better for her to learn and strengthen what she was doing rather than deflecting them and our functioning capabilities. So So the connection was bad, so I paused for a second. It looks like it's back now. So I was saying AI is both an incredibly powerful tool, but also capable of undermining our own functions and supplanting them and making us reliant and therefore weaker. So if you're using it to train yourself, if you have it as a tool that is useful, great, but just be careful. So Hamid asks, what's the solution to an anxiety disorder? Again, I do have talks on anxiety and ADHD. I also have a discussion about anxiety being primarily an attention problem. And by that, I mean anxiety is excessive and undue worry about a future event that hasn't happened. So it's not fear. It's not you're being confronted right now by a life threatening situation or something really dangerous. So part of it is just by knowing that it's at least in part an attention issue is okay, what can I direct my attention to instead? There's certainly cognitive behavioral techniques that say, if the bad thing comes up, you'll be able to fret about it then or deal with it then. I'd say very often things people are anxious about when they're actually confronting the situation, they deal with it much better than they did with the anticipation. So, so again, part of it is redirecting attention and sort of also trying to sort out, is this really particularly likely or particularly threatening? And so concern is different than anxiety, and what can I do about it? So again, it depends if this is a pure anxiety disorder, just jumping to the medication realm, very often SSRIs or other serotonergic acting medications like Buspar can be helpful. Um, Certainly, benzodiazepines tend to be quite helpful immediately with anxiety, but also tend to be so helpful that they undermine learning other strategies for dealing with the anxiety and have some huge potential for tolerance. So they become less useful the more you use them, and also a potential for addiction. Um, Yeah, if it's anxiety arising out of ADHD, it may simply be treatment of the ADHD. Because sometimes it's hard to know. So if someone's worrying, did I say the wrong thing? And they're worrying because they know they blurt things out or don't track what others are saying or lose their own thoughts and make mistakes. Again, in those scenarios, that the origin of the anxiety may well be their ADHD, and treating the ADHD can make anxiety resolve. Fill the van. I've been misdiagnosed ADHD. I have a condition that mimics ADHD. So what can I do now I'm in the UK? Um, so my question would be, what is the condition that mimics ADHD, and who? Um, yeah. So I can't say too much more. Um, I mean, if you think it's been misdiagnosed, I'd say full mental health issue condition, then the person I would see in the UK, I would say, these are my symptoms. I understand that they look like ADHD, but I've learned that it's not ADHD because of X, Y, and Z. And if you have a compelling case that it's not really ADHD, then hopefully they can treat that. At a different level, officially ADHD has to start in, you have to have symptoms before the age of 12. Um, and most people have them before the age of 5 if you can get a good enough history, so that things like head trauma or long COVID that or sleep apnea that can mimic the entire range of ADHD symptoms are officially not ADHD or maybe secondary ADHD. And again, if there's a source like ADHD or sleep apnea that's causing it, you should treat the sleep apnea first. On the other hand, what we have been finding so far is that the same medications that treat ADHD symptoms coming from ADHD often are effective in treating it when the symptoms come from another source. And to the extent we can check or tell, it looks like many of the same executive function circuits that largely are taking up space in the prefrontal cortex are the same areas being affected. So it may also may not matter terribly if it's a different condition in terms of some of the treatments. So Hamad is asking KG what ADA, what tools are they using for AI or how are they using it? And yes, sharing more about that I think would be helpful for many people here, even though it doesn't guarantee they'd help with other people, but I think sharing what one person's found useful and what ways they found it useful is helpful. So thanks, Max has the video on anxiety and attention there. Tony Fiorillo. Do you have any tips for self-checking a task for someone who is diagnosed as inattentive? So it can be a challenge to verify I completed a task fully and did not miss any steps. And the simplest tool there, I would say, is a checklist. And it's amazing. So in the non-ADHD realm, in an area where following a sequence of events is helpful enough that it actually saves lives. And I'm talking about the OR and in neonatal intensive care nurseries, just the protocol for washing your hands. It's a detailed protocol. Using a checklist improves the performance of doctors, nurses, visitors in these scenarios when, should the doctor know the sequence of events? Do they understand the importance of it? Yes, yes, but do they usually follow it? Not always. And measurably, rates of infection, rates of complications, rates of other problems are massively decreased by having a checklist. So if there's a task that you're doing multiple times, having a checklist and hopefully checking it before you and going back and checking after you've done the task to make sure you didn't leave out any steps can be helpful. I'd say the other tips would be trying to remove distractions ahead of time. And that's a common reason people with ADHD get pulled off track is that so having a workspace, whether it's closing tabs on the computer, whether it's working in a room without 14 different distractions and pets and or other, television going in the background. So simplify, eliminate distractions. Those are the two big things that are coming to mind. So Philip is dealing with hypokalemic, which is low potassium sensory overstimulation. Um, and so Bill is mentioning that Vyvanse, Elvance, lisdexamphetamine is being helpful with addressing some of the symptoms. So I don't have any more specific advice on how to find people who can help with this. And they mentioned that there's a strong genetic component, that there's at least people in the parental generation who have it as well. Yeah, and highlights ADHD can be missed and it can be overdiagnosed when it's not there. So thanks, Max. Max has provided a link to the Getting Back on Track video, which also has some advice that's relevant to what to do when you miss a step or if you're frozen up after missing a step. Excuse me. So, so Max asked, was writing an interest you always had, or did you start doing it later in life, and what helped you become a better writer? Good questions. I mean, I'm always thought of myself or aspired to be a writer. I can remember, and found it just a year or two ago, winning some, and it was probably a library who read the most books, but the reward for winning the most books um, was a book, and it wasn't a teacher; it was a special programs coordinator who inscribed it something like "Today a reader, tomorrow a leader." I never aspired to be a leader, but I liked reading, and I liked creating my own stories and scenarios. And um, I finished undergraduate in just 3 years, so I didn't have passed out of AP, out of the English requirements through AP testing. Um, I won nationwide contests with multiple winners, so I wasn't the only one. Writing contests in high school. The only English class I took in college was a creative writing class. During medical school, I won writing awards for essays essays and research writing. And then, other than being newsletter editor and columnist for my running club for more than a decade, so that was a monthly writing assignment, and I was creative, and it was well received. That was the only writing I did for years, other than writing relevant to doctor's notes. And then I had so many patients figuring out that Donald Trump had ADHD, and I started writing letters to the editor, which didn't get published, explaining how we could diagnose his ADHD, and started writing longer articles because I liked to marshal the evidence in a book. And it was when um, so the book came out a half year before COVID, but I was just gearing up and arranging book readings that COVID shut everything down in San Francisco, at least where I was. So I went to writing a weekly writing article on medium.com to promote the book, essentially. And part of that was in 52 weeks, writing 52 articles about different aspects of ADHD and how Donald Trump illustrated them, and didn't need to repeat a single topic or angle on ADHD. It's also when I started this YouTube channel. So I think most people write the way they think, and I, at least for years, was a really organized thinker, and so that helped with my writing. It was interesting writing on Medium. With many of the articles were no publication, so just under my name. But when I would put humor and puns and dad jokes in there, how often even editors completely missed them or didn't see them or notice them. Um, but I will say that I had, I'd say, maybe a writing coach when I was just getting into this and wondering where I should apply to where I should try to write. But that was of limited duration. And I've had a remote working relationship with Rob Britt. He's an editor of a publication at Medium, so he does not work for Medium. He's the editor of Wise and Well. So he was a reporter, journalist, science writer for years. And I think his editing has helped tighten particularly the focus of titles and drawing people in more quickly there. So maybe that over explains or is relevant. So yeah, I've always been interested in writing, and I have more ideas for writing books and articles than I have time to write. But yes, even though I enjoy it, writing is work. It's easy to avoid initiating the work these days. So Phil is also commenting that they cured their seizures with an antipsychotic, just an accidental medication choice. Any other questions about wolves or cows using tools or sorting out intention, or why the scenarios we so often tell about our own intentions and other intentions lock us into stories that are unhelpful and unhealthy and often not particularly accurate? But so I saw the connections fluctuating. It looks like it's back again. If there's no more questions, I will probably just wrap things up. Um, so we'll be back next week, same time. I know daylight saving shifts are coming up, um, and that Europe shifts at a different time than the US does. Hawaii doesn't change at all, but I will probably stay with essentially US mainland time. So we will not be shifting an hour. I'll be shifting an hour because Hawaii doesn't shift. But our European friends may be out of sync for a week or two till we all catch up. And I'm not sure how soon that's happening, but coming up in March. So stay healthy, stay happy. Thanks for being here. Thanks for asking great questions. Thanks for writing in comments and viewing videos, and share it with other people who may benefit, because there's clearly more than a few thousand people out there with ADHD who may benefit from what's out here. That's all.